Take my skin and leave. Enormous leaves cast a deep red shade on the land where my home once stood. It was never really mine. I did not deserve it. I stared deep into the red and accepted my judgment. We had dominion over all things and built conceited edifices. We had rule over all the world's materials. We raised forests and meadows to the ground and continued building the mausoleums of our modesty. They were the largest structures we could conceive, self-righteous testaments to our strength as a species, vast unused spaces used for nothing other than the example of our control over nature itself. We used vast mechanical skeletons to haul and raise our well-won prizes, to morph and modify our materials to suit our whim. We could make anything. That which we could not make we could take. The means were irrelevant as long as we had everything, and we saw everything as ours. The thought of our collapse was always in the back of our minds, never mentioned but always present, overcome by new purchases and buildings. We may have tried to hide it, but I'm sure we always knew there would be an end, and of course there was. Though we had always assumed there would be other people that finished us, those with stronger wills would come destroy us and take what was ours as theirs. We had done it to so many others, and it seemed the only feasible way. The cycle would continue, and one day our descendants would rule again. However, I would not be writing this if we were right. It was slow at first, as these things often are. A skin irritation, likely due to previously unseen form of mite. Doctors told this to their patients, enough patients in fact that the diagnosis was easier to give in a press release. It probably co-evolved with us as our cities expanded, just a skin irritation might leave some scars. It was assumed to not be infectious. It only impacted a small population and the scars could be easily hidden. We thought the only victim was vanity. A campaign on how to avoid discriminating against sufferers was quickly started and promptly forgotten. The irritation spread slowly. Sufferers never complained about itchiness or a desire to scratch affected areas. Ointments and placebos were prescribed to those of the medical faith. Self-styled gurus and experts prescribed complex rituals to self-cure for the unbelievers. Both schools of thought proved ineffective. The consensus was mites, like we were initially told. Something should really be done about the mites could be heard in school parking lots across the city as parents used the topic in lieu of conversation. Eventually enough voices began to shout that mandatory sanitation of all workplaces, public spaces and homes came into effect. No one had ever seen the little perpetrators, these evolved mites, yet chemicals were somehow conjured up to eradicate them. As a side effect, it also eradicated all insects, rodents and any vile creatures that would hide in the dark corners of our cavernous structures. These chemicals were highly toxic to all life. Of course, that's how we knew it would be effective. In such a large city, completion of such a task would take months, and in the interim the scars became thick growths. Extreme cases spoke through tight jaws about stiffness and a strange feeling of urgency. Medications and surgeries were quickly prescribed. There were side effects, of course. Everyone saw the eradication of flies as a plus. It was the first post-spray spring. Hay fever seemed like a myth and the pollen counts were at an effective 0. Though the lack of greenery in the city was suspicious, few really cared. The sapling was found in an old cemetery. It was hailed as a marvel as nothing else had grown in the city that season. This sapling amongst forgotten graves became the new topic of conversation for those with too much time on their hands. Always followed by talk about how much of a shame it was that it was growing in such a run-down, frightening part of the city. Time passed and the infection continued to spread. Severe cases were blamed for their lack of hygiene while everyone else continued with their lives. The second spring, and again nothing had grown. Fresh fruit and vegetables were becoming scarce. The grass had died out in all other parks, leaving just dust and earth. The sapling had grown quickly, so quickly that it could no longer be considered a sapling. It was easily 8 foot tall, or so the rumour said. The moneyed had purchased the old rundown buildings around this last vestige of greenery and the surrounding areas. Abandoned hovels became glamorous and chic housing. Buildings were torn and rebuilt taller, wider, more vacuous, more elite. Walls and gates were built to keep out the riffraff. Their lack of hygiene and sense would likely only destroy this miracle of nature. The former mansions of the affluent became full of the poor and horrendously scarred. It was here in these former temples of vanity that a new religion was born. Word of the tree was so ubiquitous in these havens of glamorous squalor that the inhabitants began to believe it was a gift from God. Others still believed the tree was God. Unlike the infection, this new religion spread rather quickly. They had a variety of titles: hippies, tree huggers, greenophiles. Obviously none of these were by choice. They saw the infection as a blessing, a shared mark of those chosen by nature. They believed that the tree belonged to all, and that all should be able to access it, not just the wealthy. Though some of these greenophiles were children of the rich who would wall themselves off, they were spoken about in hushed tones and laughter. No one took them seriously, and why would they? Running around covered in cheaply made felt in nature, Designer drugs made up chants and pretending to be trees. They seemed so harmless, though their image began to change. The tree wife was appointed head of the church. She looked the part, her skin scarred so heavily by thick growths it was akin to bark. She only spoke of the tree in loving words and tones, though she was quick to anger when reminded of her lack of access to her betrothed. She was carried by 4 of her acolytes, all wearing masks made to resemble her twisted visage, all with growths seemingly stapled onto themselves. They were now organised. They were now the children of the twisted roots. Rumours began to spread of miracle trees appearing in other cities, planted by members of the church or sold to other cities by those living in proximity to the tree. They did not need the money, but the consensus was that they wanted to show everyone that they had control. Rumours are rumours though, and while often spoken, they're just as often ignored. The tree now towered over their buildings. It was tall and proud but bare. It cast an almost skeletal shadow over the city. The children of the Twisted Roots began their assault on Greenwood. Their aim, of course, was the Arbour building, home to the wealthiest and most ardent protectors of the last great miracle. My parents had raised me to mind my own business and only get involved when I deemed it to be necessary. I did not deem this necessary. To me, this seemed like a war between the disgustingly rich and the insane, 2 groups I had no affinity towards. I moved to my parents' house on the outskirts of the city. I only know of what happened through the news and phone recordings. The children were violent and savage. The wealthy were well armed, of course, but had underestimated the number of zealots. The videos showed blood-filled gutters and chunks of the fleshy growth covered the roads. A red hue permeated throughout the footage. The corpses of the wealthy were impaled on pikes, while the dead devoted lay on the street surrounded by their injured comrades. Those who did not get in the way of the children were unharmed. The media was left unassailed and broadcasted everything in such highly defined, grisly detail. It was on the 16th day that the children were deemed victors and the tree wife finally met her love for the first and only time. The park was surrounded by corpses and devotees, but none sullied its luscious green grass. The tree wife, on the perimeter of the park, sat in a wheelchair as if she sat on a throne. Her body was unmoving and grotesque, her lips twisted as she released grunts and groans. Seemingly understanding this primal speech, an acolyte wheeled her to just out of reach of her husband. After minutes of what seemed to be a mumbled prayer from the decimated congregation, the acolyte pushed her past that final boundary of empty space. As soon as her distorted body touched the tree, it began to writhe. Her growth like scars melted into its bark. She soon disappeared and the tree fell still. The tension was palpable. We weren't there, but we knew this was happening no more than 20 minutes from us. I was terrified, but unable to keep my eyes away from the screen. A silence that can only be created by people holding their breath let me know that my parents were also witnessing this, that this was not a dream or hallucination. After what seemed like hours, the tree began to move again. Its bark seemed to dance. Large tendrils emanated from its trunk, grabbing any corpses or people they could reach. The video feed was distorted by the erratic and unworldly movement. The audio, however, was still crisp and clear. It was filled with pained, horrified screams and a horrendous creaking. The tree's leaves began to bud and redden. Its branches twisted and spiraled upwards toward heaven. Eventually the audio stopped, and the live feed was interrupted. We gathered ourselves, and in silence we all walked to the garden in a futile attempt to see if this really happened. I told myself that maybe it was just a horrible prank. But in the distance we could see it, the poisoned apple, the red foliage glowing in the sun, towering over the city. The initial death count was in the thousands. The exact figure escapes me. I could barely understand the concept of that many people existing at once, let alone all of them dying so horrendously. The tree's roots had spread in its growth, tearing up roads and collapsing buildings. The richest part of our city was now an abandoned ruin. It took a few months, but the city, with aid from the military, had built more walls and fences to keep everyone far from the tree and its roots. However, there was little they could do to stop the populace viewing the tree. The tree had been still for quite some time. Those that could not or did not wish to leave the city attempted to return to some semblance of normalcy. Normalcy, but with the addition of a red hue during daylight hours. By all accounts, the city was recovering. Slowly but surely, people began to return. I watched the city from my parents' house. I would not be returning. But I could not seem to move too far away either. I tried to keep myself focused on other things, but always found myself staring at the shimmering red leaves. As autumn progressed, the leaves changed from their deep red to a purplish colour, though sometimes as the sun set they would look black. The surviving children extended their influence and pushed the idea that we could live in harmony with the tree. In fact, many nature lovers moved to the city to be near such a miracle of nature. Those new to the city tried to find ways to get closer to the tree. Talks of bribes and which guards accepted them was rife in all circles. Apparently, there were access ways used by some scientists hired to study the tree, though no studies had ever been released. Rumours spread of the infection being caused by the tree or whatever chemicals it gave off. There were never any mites, though that seemed irrelevant to the survivors or the newcomers. The first leaves that fell seemed to be quite the novelty. Shrewd business owners with money and connections hired the desperate to collect some of the leaves. They would cut them up and sell them to tourists as mementos. Many of the buyers treated them like relics. Too far removed from the horrific events that led to the tree's gargantuan size, they enshrined these cuttings and worshipped them. Some say they used the gel that oozed from the leaves to baptize each other. The greatest cause of death was not violent. It was slow and suffocating. The rate of the leaves falling increased as we moved further into winter. One day, a particularly cold December morning, they all fell at once. The enormous black snow gracefully blanketed the city. It covered the city so completely that many buildings collapsed due to the additional weight. Those that survived the collapses were suffocated. I hope no one survived past that, as the decomposing leaves in that quantity would generate such heat that it felt like the middle of summer from where we stood. From what I recall, experts at the time theorized that it likely took days for everyone who could not escape to die. Rescue teams were not allowed into the city due to the potential hazards of this event. It was New Year's Day when the ground began to shake. The ground moved like a bull desperately trying to toss a rider from its back. Our humble home began to crack. It was not built for earthquakes. I ran outside grabbing nothing and screaming for my parents. I checked the garden and could not see them. My parents didn't make it out. I collapsed to my knees, unable to process what had happened. It still pains me to think about it. The ground continued to stir, and all the houses and buildings around me began to collapse. I knelt choking on dust and tears. Some neighbours made it out, some didn't. In my mind's eye I could see the tree through the distance in the acrid dust cloud and I knew it was there. Growing. I was paralysed, overcome by sadness, fear and loneliness. I could hear the chaos around me, but it did not register a sound. I felt as if I was floating in an infinite red ocean, alone, and millions of miles from home. A neighbour dragged me out of the ocean and the ruins of my former house. They guided me into a car with others who had survived, all just as distraught. The neighbour said the government would come looking for survivors. We just had to hold out until the dust settled. The earth stopped shaking. I watched the dust fall slowly. It seemed like the spirits of those that died being pulled back to the ground. We stayed in the car for 2 days. The stench was unbearable. We were starving and thirsty. The dust had settled like a thick layer of snow. We wished to mourn but couldn't. We had to survive. To do so, we had to scavenge through the remnants of our lives and find supplies. The neighbour told us that we should check the ruins of other houses and stay away from our own. I now know this was to avoid finding our loved ones dead. We buried those we could find and gathered what we could. Once we felt we had enough, we searched for all the working vehicles we could find. 30 of us survived, and in silent agreement, we knew that we needed to move as far from here as possible. We drove slowly along the destroyed roads until we saw the wall in the distance. It was tall and foreboding, a large ditch dug in front of it. We all hit the car horns to attract the attention of the constructors of this monstrosity. After about an hour, we heard motors on the other side. The neighbour, who had by default become our leader, shouted to them with a hoarse and broken voice. But there was no response. Strange hollow metallic sounds were followed by whistles and something coming over the wall. They exploded as they fell. The sound and dust brought back visions of my parents' demise. I grabbed whoever I could find and ran back towards the now ruined suburb. In total, 10 of us made it far enough to survive. Filled with sadness and cowardice, we did not return to look for the other survivors. Our vehicles were destroyed, and we had no shelter. 2 former scouts decided they could make a makeshift tent from the gargantuan leaves. We needed 10. It took days of moving them to gather them all and bring them back to what would become our camp. As they began to divide the leaves, they carefully discarded the ooze into some of the ruins. The tents were ramshackle. Haste could be seen in their construction, but they provided shelter and surprising warmth. Time passed and we managed to survive, and continued surviving, the colossal tree ever dominating the landscape. We became proficient hunters and found some domesticated dogs who had packed together but were open to a truce. We would provide them with food, they would help us hunt and find resources. Some members of the group decided that they wished to return to the wall and attempt to scale it. We tried to persuade them but did not fight them to stay. We wished them luck and gave them their fair share of supplies. There was dissent from some survivors, but they were overruled. 4 left and never returned. I hope they made it out, but I'm not optimistic of their chances. We had avoided building permanent structures. Though there had not been an earthquake since, we did not wish to take the risk. 2 of the dissenters of our group had become a couple, and were wary of the rest of the group. They would move their tent further from the group. They had become paranoid and began to worship the tree. They were discovered consuming the flesh of another survivor, shapes of branches and leaves carved into their skin. They fled towards the city. In their tent we found bowls of the red ooze and spoons. It seemed they had been eating it. On the lining of their tent were the words, "We will become the tree, we will join it, it will be ours." We buried what was left of their victim and left a makeshift grave marker. We decided we would need to keep watch in case they tried to return and steal from us. In my dreams I see them lost in the city, so close to their goal, yet never reaching it. It brings me some solace to think that they will die having achieved nothing. Another one of our group could not handle the stress of the recent events. Maybe they had tried to reach out to us. Maybe I couldn't see it. Or perhaps I had already stopped caring. Regardless, we found their body covered in vomit and huddled beside Blue, one of the dogs. In their despair, they seemingly did not want to die alone and took Blue with them. An empty bleach bottle sat beside them, a squirreled away relic kept hidden from us. They left a note. It was left unread. Myself and my only human companion buried Blue and gave him funeral rites. We burnt the coward's corpse and poured the ashes in with the shit of the toilet pit outside the camp. As more time passed, the other survivor and I grew distant and barely spoke. One day they approached me, their arm covered in the easily recognisable growth. I knew by the look in their eyes what it was they wanted me to do. I asked if they were sure. Their tears confirmed, and they knelt. They told me that they wished to die human and in control. They wished to die like a warrior from one of their books. I breathed heavy and raised the block. I struck them hard and quick. I tried what I could to make it as painless as possible. I buried them beside Blue. In my mind I gave them some funeral rites too. They were made up, of course, but it would be my last kindness to them. Now there's just me. I long since gave up on keeping time and have grown so very tired of surviving. I've released the dogs and left their food out. I write this as my last act. I do not know who will read it, or if it will ever be read. I'm not even sure why I write this. As I write, the enormous leaves cast a deep red shade on the land where my home once stood. It was never really mine. I did not deserve it. I stared deep into the red and accept my judgment. Perhaps we deserved all this. Perhaps I deserved all this. Perhaps I did not. It is not for me to know, and certainly wouldn't change anything. I will spend my last days simply watching the tree with its dark red leaves.